So hello, I'd like to thank Director Zugata and the organizers of this event for being able to speak to you. It really is a pleasure to be here after such a long delay. I don't know which was worse, the pandemic or a British transport strike, but they both have been overcome. So I apologize for speaking English. I hope the translation is coming through. I think you're on channel 1. I hope that's working well. Right, well, as you know, today I'll be talking about the gallery's research and restoration of the London Virgin of the Rocks. I have to admit to feeling a little hesitation at first about speaking about this treatment, as it took place quite a while ago now, and it has been very widely published. But I think that apart from anything to do with Leonardo being interesting, I'd like to show our work as an example of how museum conservation can be a really important part of integrated research, multidisciplinary research, with all sorts of unanticipated outcome. In this case, ultimately, it led to our Leonardo exhibition, which itself seemed to be near the beginning of a whole cascade of Leonardo-related treatments, research exhibitions in Paris, in Madrid, in Milan, etc. Whether or not we get such an outcome, I think the principle of combining conservation, curatorial, and scientific expertise within the setting of a conservation treatment of important works of art is essential to what we do, especially in a museum context. And I think ultimately it gives the best, most rewarding experience for us and our many, many audiences. So I'd like to start with a summary of the traditional understanding of the genesis of the Virgin of the Rocks. So it was first commissioned from the Confraternity of the Immaculate Conception at San Francesco Grande, April 1483, not long after Leonardo arrived in Milan. And the contract gives the work to Leonardo and the brothers Ambrogio and Evangelista de Predis. These are local artists who are already established in the guild in Milan. The commission included panel paintings of the Virgin and 2 flanking groups of musician angels, all of which were to be set within a carved altarpiece incorporating a sculpture already made between 1480 and 1482 by Giacomo del Maino. Now, here are a couple of examples of Maino's work, just to give you a sense. And here's a kind of comical, speculative reconstruction, just to put the National Gallery inside such a rich, decorative context, to give you some idea of how it might have functioned. And I often say, I think the painting must have been something like the way people who speak quietly in a noisy room bring attention to themselves. I think it's a really interesting contrast, and to think of it going in that kind of context. Anyway, the painting seems to have been finished in the mid-1480s, and now it's widely agreed to have been the Virgin of the Rocks now in the Louvre. Having finished the picture, it seems that there was a dispute about the fee being lower than the value, very modern conflict. Unable to reach agreement with the confraternity, after submitting a petition to the Duke of Milan sometime between 1491 and 1494, this painting was sold to an unknown third party. At some stage in this decade, it is believed that a replacement version was begun, the painting now in London in the National Gallery. This second version was installed in the chapel by 1503, but there was more dispute about payment and lack of completion in 1506, which no doubt is largely because of Leonardo being away from and being in Florence between 1501 and 1506, which we know he was involved with the Battle of Anghiari, and among other things. After his return to Milan in 1506, it seems the Virgin of the Rocks project was restarted, and the painting finally being considered finished enough for payment, the last payment in 1508. So this is a 25-year process from beginning to end. It's complicated even for Leonardo, and it's led to huge discussion as to exactly when the second National Gallery picture was begun, and the even more complex question of how consistently it may have been worked on, or, since this is about Leonardo, how long and how roughly, how frequently and when it might have been abandoned while he worked on other things, more prestigious projects in Milan, like The Last Supper or the equestrian monument to Francesco Sforza. The Commission also raises two important issues of interpretation. How much collaboration was there between Leonardo and his associates? And how do we explain the inconsistency in the level of finish that the work has now? And so technical studies that we did before and during the restoration have provided some insights into these questions, and I think more importantly, it's instructive to see how you can apply those results to thinking about Leonardo. So this painting remained in Milan until 1780, when it was purchased and brought to England by Gavin Hamilton. It passed through two more English collections until it was finally acquired by the National Gallery from the Earl of Suffolk in 1880. At this point, its five-member panel was thinned, cradled by a famous British restorer called Morrell shortly after acquisition, for no reason, really. It just was what people did. Fortunately, the panel has remained stable, and the application of the cradle hasn't caused any problems, which is rare, especially since we've had air conditioning in the gallery in the 20th century. In 1880, there may have been a little bit of thinning of the varnish. There's some references to removal of varnish in connection with treating the surface for fogging or bloom. But a real comprehensive cleaning and restoration didn't happen until Helmut Ruhrmann worked on the picture in 1948 and 9. And here's a detail of when Ruhrmann finished his treatment. The varnish he removed was very dark and brown, and you can see in this detail he left 2 or 3 small dark brown squares on the edge of the painting. You can see on the detail on your left. We analyzed those varnishes, those 19th or even 18th century varnishes with GCMS, and we found that the varnish Ruhrmann removed had mastic, damar, fir balsam, and linseed oil all together, probably several layers at once. This is a very complex mixture of materials, but we think, having found the oleoresin fir balsam, it strongly suggests that this varnish was applied in the 19th century, before it entered the National Gallery. Both the composition of the varnish and the degree of its discoloration suggest that any cleaning which occurred when the picture came into the gallery must have left quite a lot of this old varnish on the surface. Now, I don't really want to talk about Ruhrmann's work in much detail today, but it was clear that the varnish he put on in 1948 had aged rather poorly. He used mastic resin and turpentine with a lot of wax added and linseed oil, all of which recorded in the conservation dossier and confirmed by our analysis. And that was a combination which you could be sure would produce rapid yellowing and desaturation. And then a microcrystalline wax layer was applied on top, probably to dull and even the surface, was guaranteed really to enhance the accumulation of surface dirt. So Ruhrmann's surface layer, after 60 years, had degraded so much, it really was difficult to read the surface, and especially to understand Leonardo's modeling from light to dark, which really is the most important and distinctive quality of his painting method, certainly at this time. And here's an image taken in the gallery shortly before the beginning of our treatment. And this really was the reason for that treatment. So the practical intention behind the treatment was to, above all, dedicated to the visitor's visual experience and reading and understanding of the painting. And this treatment came at the end of many years of study in the National Gallery, both of this work in particular and many paintings made by Leonardo's Milanese associates and assistants from within our own collection. We have, I've forgotten now, 25 or more Leonardeschi paintings in the gallery. And we began a program of examining, studying, restoring a number of these paintings within the collection starting 10 years before, some of which were by painters who possibly were involved with the Virgin of the Rocks itself, such as Giovanni Antonio Boltraffio or Ambrogio de Predis. And some initial works, results of this work, were published in our magazine, our technical bulletin, in 1996, and then again in greater detail in 2011. And this work was essential. This exploratory work, this campaign of restoration was essential to our understanding of artistic intent and painting techniques in the Virgin of the Rocks itself. So the treatment of the Leonardo panel represents the cumulative research and experience of many colleagues in the conservation, curatorial, and scientific departments. Here's a slide I made a long time ago. This is the core group from about 15 to 20 years ago. And of course, since then, there have been many, many more colleagues from these departments involved in Leonardo studies. So the scientific study we did with the treatment of Leonardo, that is the imaging and the analysis, was directed primarily to guide the treatment, but also to help us get to grips with the genesis of the work, to see exactly how it might fit within that long and complicated narrative of both how his studio worked and how this commission eventually was met. And so much of that research was a blend of conservation study and problem solving, painting technique, and art historical interpretation. And looking back now, it's interesting to see how the interpretation has evolved because of our conservation work and has carried on long after it was completed. Now, turning to Roman's documentation, his documentation of his 1940s treatment was very thorough, and there were dozens of very detailed photographs from that period, which were essential for our work. We benefited from information discovered through non-invasive, newer imaging methods available to us then, in 2005-10, included digital infrared reflectography, X-radiography, and the image processing of all that. The results of a new infrared examination, new at the time, of the picture were published by Luc Sisson and Rachel Billinge in 2005. And this revealed the presence of a completely different initial composition beneath the revised version of the commission. I think you can see some of the, there we go, here. These red lines show some of the underdrawing we could see in 2005. And it's a composition the authors argued linked that first design, the one underneath, to Leonardo's activity in the early 1490s, and therefore established and confirmed the chronology of the London picture. I'll just show. I mean, this head of abandoned head of the Virgin, you can just about see, I hope. Not sure how well it reads. There's her eye and nose. It comes ultimately from drawing study made for St. Philip, from the Last Supper. Let's see what else we have here. Oh, there, that explains that very well. And this hand here is also a motif he uses and recycles. You can see it in Cecilia Gallerani, the portrait in Krakow, and also Boltraffio used it in an altarpiece in Berlin now. So all these links to things happening in the 1490s in Milan were very important, I think, to help us establish some key facts about our picture. And here's another infrared image. Also, it helped us to understand better the condition of the work, particularly when you combined it with visible light photography and X-radiographs. And so we took lots of we took all the large format 1940s photographs and scanned them and digitized them. And that's a good trick because these negatives are extraordinary. They have got a lot of information, and you can overexpose them and see information in the darks, and they have a lot of information in the lighter tones as well that you can tell. Doing this, you can't tell from just a hard print. So we did that with all of our photographs, so we could really see the state of the thing in 1948. And the resolution of these old photographs was very, very high. And here you can see how we could make such close comparisons of cleaning details between 1949 and 2009. And here you can see absolute confirmation that this old abrasion of the eyelash of the Virgin was pre-existing. We digitized the X-ray mosaic to remove virtually the cradle, which suddenly made it a very legible and revealing document. This sort of thing people do all the time now, but it was pretty advanced in 2009. Now, I have some images of the cleaning of the picture, which we did in 2008, and I don't know how well they're going to read. I hope you can see. But the point I want to use them for is not to show where the damages were, but to show you how the key gain from cleaning this picture was not a dramatic color change, but a better saturation of the darker tones, and then a reading of the transitions from light to dark. Let me go through. It sort of starts, you'll see an image sort of starting cleaning here and across in a kind of counterclockwise circle. I don't know how well you can tell. Well, you can see already, look at how this color changes. That's the saturation from removal of the varnish. And it carries on going down through the figures of the Baptist and the angel. Oh, I've gone ahead of myself. So this cleaning, I think, gives you a much clearer understanding of that modeling range, the volume and spatial relationships. And so the point of the cleaning was to get that visual gain by removing varnish, to reduce the varnish till we got the gain we want. We weren't just out to remove old varnish. And so here's an ultraviolet light photograph taken during cleaning, and you can see that there's still a fair bit of fluorescence on the bits that I have cleaned, meaning that I wasn't chasing all the old varnish. As long as I got the result I wanted, I was happy. We also took a selective approach to some of Ruhrmann's old restoration underpaints. You can see in these areas of total loss, like here, that's Ruhrmann's after cleaning. I kept, his glazes were not very stable, but his underpaint was completely stable, and we left it in some cases where we thought it was quite useful. So we left some of them as a basis for our own retouching, which followed in 2009 and 10. Now, I'll say a little bit now about the investigation, a typical kind of technical investigation that we would do to understand the painting technique. I know cross-sections are a little bit daunting, but they're tiny samples through the paint layers, minuscule, that we can look at and photograph under the microscope and do more and more analysis with these tiny samples as well. Combining them with the new kinds of imaging, I think, is a kind of gold standard of sort of cross-referencing and looking at the materiality of the picture, the layer structure, and how it's made. So we can see it was prepared, the panel was prepared conventionally with a layer of gesso, that's calcium sulfate, dihydrate, over which a light, fairly warm gray imprimatura layer was applied in two applications. The lower layer was mostly lead white and carbon black, while the upper one contained a little bit of lead yellow. We could tell that the binding medium of the imprimatura was untreated walnut oil. Other analysis indicated that lead soap formation had taken place, presumably in the layer with the lead tin yellow. And this could account for why it looks a bit more translucent in some of the cross-sections. The imprimatura was probably smoothed and patted down with the hand, since we see finger and palm prints all over the X-radiograph. You can see them in certain parts with your eye. You can see the texture of fingerprints, which is very exciting. People who think they can see Leonardo's hand. But they're not in the paint itself. He did do that earlier in his life, but in this case, all those handprints are in the priming, which is something that Vasari described about 50 years later in writing about his Trattato. I'm afraid that means that those handprints are probably Leonardo's assistants and young apprentices and not him still. So the fluid underdrawing of that first composition was drawn directly on the gesso. And we have quite a few cross-sections which show a very thin layer with some carbon black in a brown kind of matrix below the imprimatura, below the paint layer that's put directly on the gesso. We also found other drawing layers in the cross-section above the imprimatura, as you can see in the sample of the yellow lining of the Virgin's robe. I'm not sure if we can see. Yeah, this. Am I pressing the right thing? Whoop. That one? No. Well, anyway, I think you can see on the upper left it says further drawing above the imprimatura. And so we made that idea of drawing being above the imprimatura maybe what we see in these details from Christ's arm, where you see a thin yellow layer absolutely going over the drawing line. You can see it in these details of the second, the composition that we see. So the question of how the drawing evolves from the cartoon, you know, the first transfer of a paper design, both above and below the imprimatur layers, is very complicated given the first composition being underneath as well. We thought from the beginning the second imprimatura may have been applied sometime after that first layer, just to partially cancel out the presence of the initial composition. It's quite confusing to draw a drawing on top of a drawing. In any case, it's quite difficult to make. It's hard to know when drawing stops and painting begins in most of Leonardo's works. His drawing gradually kind of morphs, it evolves into a tonal, monochromatic brownish underpainting, and that's one of the most distinctive aspects of his painting technique at this time. You can see it most famously in the unfinished Adoration of the Magi, in the Uffizi. Here's before treatment, and here, quite wonderful recent treatment is the same picture after treatment, and also the St. Jerome in the Vatican, where you see the evolution from drawing to undermodeling to dead color to nearly finished parts. It's all there in the St. Jerome in the Vatican. So there are parts of the National Gallery painting which are basically very much like that stage. So in the vegetation and the rocks immediately above the Baptist, this kind of tonal brown washy stuff. Oh, what have I done here? Okay, never mind. No, I'm sorry, the pointer's tired. But anyway, you can see that, I hope. And we can see this brown undermodeling phase in many, many cross-sections taken from the National Gallery painting. So you can see that brown layer underneath the flesh paint here in a sample of a foot of the Baptist, which was never very finished anyway. And also, you can see the brown layer underneath the blue robe, the Virgin's blue mantle. And so this underpainting really is key to the remarkable sense of tonal unity and convincing modeling that makes the picture so striking, whatever the colors applied on top. I think that's the key exploration of Leonardo's interest in how light works and how vision works and how local colors become less intense when they get darker. You know, all shadows go brown-black, whether the thing is blue or yellow. And that's very different than the kind of quattrocento idea of a blue thing having a dark blue shadow and a yellow thing having a dark yellow shadow. And that's based very much on how he studied how the eye works and how vision functions. It's really fundamental to this picture, I think. Anyway, see, I moved ahead with the slide. There are very few published studies of Leonardo's paint medium, and it's a subject we tried to do in some detail. I think it's a really interesting question, given that so many of his works have wrinkling, cracking, and shrinkage, like you see here, associated with poor drying. Interestingly, we have a Polaiuolo in the studio in the National Gallery now that has very much the same sort of techniques, and there's a lot of speculation about Leonardo's first exposure to oil painting may be coming via the Polaiuolo studio. Anyway, while the imprimatura and the majority of the upper paint layers were applied in walnut oil, the gray underpaint of the Virgin's tunic, the mauve underpaint of the angel's drapery are both bound in heat-bodied or partially heat-bodied linseed oil. And so there is some distinction in medium, but our analysis suggests these materials are quite conventional for Italian painting. You see both of those materials constantly. So the paint defects we see with Leonardo are more the result of thick applications, inadequate drying times, and particularly in the poorly drying ultramarine, brown, and black passages, rather than the use of experimental or novel paint binder. And this is quite interesting because it's just kind of bad luck that the things he's interested in exploring with oil paint, the distinctions between dark, very dark, and extremely dark, happen to occur with pigments that chemically are very, very poor dryers in oil paint. And so all these areas where he's working on these things, trying to see what he can express in oil paint, they hadn't really worked out how to use the medium in a way that it would work well with these particular pigments. The deteriorated condition of the Virgin's ultramarine mantle is quite disturbing, I think, in our reading of the painting. And that's because the relatively richly colored passage, it's one of the brightest, most intense colors in the whole picture. And unfortunately, the glazes of natural ultramarine applied over azurite are quite rough textured and broken up, and there's loss of intrinsic color in the blue pigment itself, an irreversible chemical effect, unfortunately. And so the most serious problem of interpretation in these parts is the partial loss of the modeling in the folds of fabric, which now do appear more flat and formless in comparison with their intended modeling and volumetric and tonal structure. You can just see that very easily by comparing the blue to the adjoining yellow drapery folds. Now here I talk a little bit about a red lake pigment. This is an example, I think, of where the scientific study leads to someplace quite interesting. Not really essential for the restoration itself, but still, it's fascinating and helps us understand how the picture became in the condition it is. So we found a red lake pigment in the Virgin's tunic. It was applied in a mixture with some lead white, a little bit of black. So red, black, and white over a dark gray underlayer to make a kind of deep mauve, a structure which is now difficult to read since the upper layer of paint is very broken up. And the same mixture was put in the underlayer of the angel's blue drapery. You can see here, this area of the painting was more damaged than anywhere else in the whole image. And after removal of some of Ruhrmann's retouchings, this underlayer was exposed in several large paint losses. And you can see it there in the cross-section as well, this kind of deep purpley brown color. So cross-sections, it's going to get a bit technical for a minute, forgive me. Cross-sections from both areas of the painting show these rounded, translucent particles, which show very strong fluorescence in ultraviolet light. You can see the arrows on the image on your right. And then we did ATR, FTIR, it's an analytic technique, performed on the cross-section from the drapery, and that showed that these images were kind of starch. And so you can see these red-orange hotspots, which correspond with fluorescent particles. And if we do the spectrum from that area, it shows the same thing. It aligns very well with the spectrum of starch. And so it's possible that the damage which has happened in these areas, the worst damage in the whole painting, is related to using starch in the manufacture of the pigments, which made that paint vulnerable. We think perhaps the starch had a very high hygroscopic response, that is, it's changing and reacting to changes in humidity, which make it move and become less fixed. Because the only areas of the picture to have suffered substantial damage, top layers of the Virgin's tunic and the underlayer of the angel's mantle, are exactly these areas that have a lot of concentrations of starch extended red lake. The starch is part of the substrate for the coloring matter itself. And this is the earliest example we've found where we found starch in a red lake paint. It's most likely to be present as part of the manufacturing of the pigment. And there's a 15th century manuscript, for example, which has a recipe for a Brazil wood lake in which the addition of fine flour or starch and powder is mentioned. It's not known how widely this type of recipe would have been used, made from other dyestuffs. But given the red color is still visible in this picture, it seems unlikely that this is Brazil wood, which was a relatively cheap and impermanent red. There we go. There you can see, again, that color. Just going to move back now to think about the wider question now. One of the most intriguing issues around our painting has had to do with its relationship, as we've said, with the painting in the Louvre. So we thought a lot about how our new insights and discoveries around the painting might clarify the relationship. I mean, just looking superficially first, it's obvious the National Gallery is not just a copy of the first version. The pose, gestures, draperies of the angel are substantially changed. The London picture has halos for all the figures apart from the angel. Whether or not they're original is another story, but the infant John the Baptist has his cross depicted in the slight relief of applied gilded tin, and these also are absent from the Paris version. And Leonardo, you really don't see him being interested in just repeating himself. And the technical study we did do, gives us some idea of this characteristic pattern of changes in fiddling and adjustment made as he developed the second version. we could see the head of Christ in our painting was initially based on the reversed cartoon, now in the Louvre, first used for the Louvre John the Baptist. Here I can just show you, there's the cartoon and the Louvre John the Baptist. Now, this is an X-ray of our Christ. If I spin the cartoon around, and you can see, I can line it up over what is the, see there's an underpaint, there's a change, there's a first depiction of Christ, basically as the cartoon. And then later on, Leonardo changed the whole head entirely into this profile study, which is based on this red chalk drawing now in the Royal Collection. And we can also see some indication of revision and changing through looking at cross-sections, which seems to have accompanied this discontinuous, this stop-start execution of the painting. There's a big change in the left contour of the Virgin's shoulder and mantle, you can see with the naked eye, but it was first blocked in with that brown paint we've talked about, and then left a bit unresolved, actually, in the final result. And we can also see that brown paint used to edit the relationship between the Baptist's foot and the Virgin's drapery. Here, the brown paint is just blocked in on top of finished blue drapery, no doubt intended to be worked up again, maybe with some foliage or a different drapery, but it's just been left like that. It's quite surprising, you know, when you see it in the studio and you see these areas that are so unfinished and unresolved. It's very, very much more present, I think, visually than it is in the galleries. And here we can see that brown paint in the Baptist left foot as well. So that pentiment, as I said, has been just left as an unmodulated brown applied over the blue, with it's even less resolved than the foot painted on top of it, which isn't finished. Now here's the Baptist's other foot on the left, which is just basically sketched in. It's hardly taken beyond underdrawing, and the same technique applies to the angel's hand, which you can see also is basically underdrawing on top of the priming. It happens to be in a very shadowed part of the painting, and it works quite well. But it's staggering how incomplete it is, or how little worked up it is. And so we find consistencies in finish like this throughout the painting, and that suggests a variation in the amount he completed it that's partially artistic intent, and I think also expediency in the circumstances of the commission and Leonardo's chaotic life and traveling and all those things. Interesting, we look at the sky and we can see the sky at the upper right, which has a very typical layer of ultramarine blue, the more purpley blue, applied over the more green azurite. It doesn't have any of the fine modulations we see in other parts of the painting. So in the detail in the lower right, you see it just moves with a bump from one color to the other with a line. And elsewhere, it's modulated very, very softly. And the fact that we see this ridge of dark blue paint in the upper right, and that hard line between that and the azurite underneath, it suggests to us that maybe this sky was finished while the picture was in its frame in the chapel in situ. This is consistent with the documentary evidence, which suggests the picture was installed at San Francesco Grande in 1503, but also there was a last effort to complete the work in 1506 to finally get the money in 1508. And interestingly enough, we can see that this visual difference we see in the sky, we can also see in different paint media. In both cases, the azurite was applied in walnut oil, and then the ultramarine in the upper right is bound in linseed oil. And this is probably the easiest, most visible example of all kinds of inconsistencies in the execution of the picture. Some of them are the result of lack of finish. Some might suggest the participation of collaborators or assistants in Leonardo's studio. And also we have to remember, 15 years between starting and finishing this work, we believe, at least the second composition, may reveal significant changes in Leonardo's own paint handling. And we also think that maybe if there is a substantial amount of work done in situ, it certainly would have been painted in very different lighting, and it might result in a very different way of handling the paint, probably rather bolder. So it's quite hard to judge how the appearance of any particular feature could be influenced by all these factors. Interpretation is complicated by changes in passages which are the result of degradation or pigment alteration, like the Virgin's drapery also. But here we have these hot, rather orange colors of the Virgin's hair at the top, near the top of her head, are very different in character than this rather fine silvery hair at the end of her tresses. And this disjunction seems to result from a division of labor, the same way you can find in comparing, say, the angel's hair, which surely must be Leonardo, and the more kind of mechanical, I feel, wig-like locks of Christ and the Baptist. But as I say, that division of labor might not be a different hand, but Leonardo working in a different manner many years later, maybe in lower levels of lighting. So this variation in finish gives us lots of interpretive problems. How do you explain the difference in the Virgin's left and right hand? Is it different painters, or maybe the extended hand simply isn't finished, isn't worked up as much? Here's a much clearer example in the comparison of Christ's blessing arm, which is definitely not finished. It's just the underdrawing and first blocking in, and the Baptist hand, which is taken to a much higher level of finish, much more fully developed. And so it goes. You find these things in Christ's left foot, which I think looks pretty unsatisfactory compared to this beautiful underdrawing you can see on the left, with the big toe different in size and shape and articulated differently than the 4 other toes. And I liken the toes in the finished version looking like piano keys lined up. But although the Paris picture has exactly the same foot. So it's quite complicated to figure out how you explain these differences. There are all kinds of reasons that could lie behind them. I think it is clear that a very old-fashioned critical model of attribution used to say, oh, the figures are by Leonardo, every other part is the studio. And that hugely oversimplifies this complicated history of the picture. Some have stated that this work is entirely by the hand of Leonardo, every brushstroke. And whether or not you agree with that, it does seem reasonable to say that he was the principal painter of the larger part of the image. It may not be possible to determine the authorship of every brushstroke or to interpret the exact intent behind each unfinished element. But I think it's important to understand this inconsistency, however you want to explain it, when you come to both clean and to retouch the picture, and not to impose a false finish or homogeneity in your retouching. So just as the reduction of the varnish in the cleaning was done to give the result we wanted aesthetically, the retouching was carried out with the goal of achieving maximum legibility, but only guided by its inherent condition and its uneven execution. So obviously, losses were retouched deceptively, sometimes using Ruhmann's unaltered tempera underpaints, and which were left in place. And other parts, like the damage of the angel's drapery, we cleaned further and did a better optical match by completely redoing all of the layers, the red underneath and the blue above, for example, to capture that optical interaction in the retouching of the losses. Drying cracks, well, we toned or matched them where we thought that they were so distracting that the pattern they made across modeling would help you, would keep you from understanding the modeling that Leonardo was aiming for. Little losses and abrasion were often painstakingly retouched, particularly in the foreground, but no attempt was made to correct the inherent chemical change in the ultramarine of the Virgin's drapery. So there's a variety of kind of strategies about retouching, which I think is very common, but it's useful to lay them out quite clearly. So our wider purpose was for the retouching, to do no more than let you understand as fully as possible the painterly effects that survived, that always been there, and also I think it's important that you could see better these peculiar characteristics, the uneven execution. So, I mean, turning away again from the restoration, I'd like to go back to the question of the painting's evolution, in particular how the study of its underdrawing has been so important. Now, I said before, the 15-year-old research placed the work firmly in the Leonardo studio, displaying an underdrawing of a composition with strong links to Leonardo's activity, generally agreed to have been taking place in Milan in the 1490s. And we could see motifs like Cecilia Guararani's Hand or The Last Supper and other drawn studies. And this fitted very neatly into the idea of Leonardo testing out a new composition, the abandoned one, once faced with the need to replace the picture now in Paris. So rather than just repeat it, he tried something completely different. For whatever reason, he then thought, oh, I'll do a variation on the Paris painting. I mean, these linkages between our abandoned composition and other works have become even clearer and stronger thanks to research done by my colleagues in the scientific department, led by Marika Spring and Catherine Higgett and Marta Melchiori. And they've exploited these extraordinary advances in the last decade using new imaging techniques, including scanning XRF mapping, hyperspectral imaging, and more important, these new mathematical models they have, which I cannot understand, to process all the data this new imaging can gather. I'm going to have to summarize their work very broadly, but I think it's fair enough to say these new methods have hugely enhanced our ability to see all kinds of new preparation work, including drawing materials containing zinc, like we find in drawings on paper, and modeling these images in a way to subtract distracting noise. And the difference is staggering. Here you can see a comparison of our understanding of composition A, the abandoned composition, in 2004 on your right, just using infrared, and a more recent image with combining all these different imaging techniques and data processing, which Marika and Catherine have made. I would urge you to look at a long article in our most recently published Technical Bulletin 2021, and you can read this in great detail. We can now see the Christ child held by an angel in the lower right that we always thought was there, but we just couldn't find it, as well as two different poses for the Virgin, each with links to other drawings or paintings. So let's see. You can see we've got both the Virgin with arms crossed and with an arm extended. And both of these relate to drawings made by Leonardo and generally agreed to be dated in the 1490s. There's one from the Met, I think. No, Royal Collection. And here's the one also from the Royal Collection. Here you can see with their hand extended, just as one of the underdrawing versions we have shows, which in turn links to St. Jerome. See the same motif of one hand in and one arm out, and to show intense emotion. That was one of the variations he tried in this composition. And then here also are some, this is the Met study, isn't it? Yeah, showing the different variations. Here's one with arms crossed, like the drawing. So it plugs in even more strongly to all these different things he was trying out. So this new imaging, I think, has raised quite important questions for the relationship between the final version of the London painting and the Paris painting, though. I'm just going to go back here and show you again one of the variations of composition A and Philip from The Last Supper. And you can see again this how closely tied they are. So the London painting, as it is now, had been understood as a reprise, more or less, of the Paris painting. Incomplete in parts, inconsistent in finish, some different stylistic qualities, but deriving in nearly every principal element from the completed, highly finished painting now in Paris, thought to be finished in the 1480s. This has become hard to reconcile, however, with new evidence of changes, big changes, in our composition that we see now, the second composition of the London painting, which eventually arrive at answers that we see in the Louvre picture. For example, the arrangement of the Virgin's shoulder and drapery that we saw before. I mean, the question is, could the National Gallery's version of this final composition have been begun before the Paris picture? I mean, fixing its elements and then abandoned a long time ago in favor of the second picture, and then finished later? It's very complicated. I'm not sure what I think. what would this mean for the dating of all these interlocking network of other works so clearly related to composition A? There's much, much more to study and think about. But I guess that's not really why I'm here today. I don't want to sort of give a theory, my theory of the evolution of this picture, but I guess most important for the idea of this course is to show you how a relatively straightforward conservation treatment, if it takes place within a well-resourced environment of good interdisciplinary research, where that's part of the institution's kind of DNA, you can spark off a whole range of fascinating, unanticipated, and important interpretive consequences. Another area of endless discussion and debate around Leonardo, I think, is closer to the conservator's experience of treatment, has to do with the question of connoisseurship, authorship, and attribution. And I say that because we spend so much time looking close at works that our Morellian responses, that is, really understanding fine details of handling, little tics, habits, are usually pretty highly developed. Even as understanding technique and materials can give us, I think, a pretty well-rounded sense of the corporate or collaborative sense of how a typical Renaissance painting studio ran. I think it's really important to communicate that effectively to the public. I think the public still, many people still have a kind of 19th century model of unique authorship by a single person, the artist in the attic creating, which is not really how these Renaissance studios worked. And so these strands of thinking about the act of painting, I think, are really relevant, that is, connoisseurship and collaboration, when thinking about the London Virgin of the Rocks. It has its own history of being thought about in a rather unnuanced, binary sort of way. I mean, the 19th century art historiography is about, is it better or worse than the Paris picture? Is it by him or by his workshop? Either or. And I think that's really not the right question to ask. And I think it might seem inconsistent that we now accept a certain degree of uncertainty in attribution of every detail, even as we know more and more about how the painting was made. But I think that is part of the understanding of how studying painting technique can really best be applied to a complicated thing like this. I mean, to me, I think you can see Leonardo's hand, not just looking at the best parts, the bits you like, the most skillful bits of painting, but the whole creative process this picture shows: abandoned compositions, changes, adjustments, delays, inability to finish. That is very authentically Leonardo, I think. From this perspective, I think areas that look problematic to an art historian of 50 or 100 years ago have a certain authenticity today, I think. I think they give that sense of the kind of chaotic authenticity that is very typical of Leonardo. It's a different kind of understanding of what we mean by technique, and I think one which would have been inconceivable without thinking about technical study and analysis and seeing how it fits into the wider critical discussion. More personally, I found it interesting to experience, these certainties that we had 10 or 15 years ago that I was, very rigorously part of developing, being tested by new research. I mean, as conservators, we think all the time about the provisional nature of treatment. Indeed, we spend most of our time revisiting, amending, removing old restorations. And although we dedicate ourselves to longevity and permanent materials, reversibility, I don't know how many of us really imagine somebody coming along, looking and thinking, no, I don't like that treatment, I'm going to wash it off. Even as we look at the history of conservation and see that's what happens all the time. And so it's interesting to see that happen already kind of intellectually to some of the conclusions we've had. I take some comfort, though, in how our work integrates such a range of expertise from my scientific and curatorial colleagues. And I feel a bit humbled to be part of that whole chain of people who've thought so deeply about this painting and the artist. I look forward with great interest to seeing what the next discoveries will be and how they keep developing our feeling for this extraordinary artistic personality. So that's where I'm going to stop and say thank you very much. Do we want to I think we can have a question session now, if I can get this thing on. If anybody has any questions. I don't. Yes, yes, I can hear you. Yeah. So if you do, just make yourself known. Okay. Yeah, just raise a hand if you have a question. I don't know what to make of this. Is that good? Okay, well, thank you. I guess we'll stop there then. Thanks again.